In our recent federal election here in Australia, we had over 120 million views of Oz votes on polling day alone on Twitter. And that's actually pretty impressive when you consider that's 6 per person in the country. And at the same time, we had over 29,000 mentions of democracy sausage during the day. And quite possibly a lot of them to do with Bill demonstrating how not to eat one. So really, is it all just noise on social media, or is there actually some kind of valuable, useful information we can dig out of there? And assuming there is, what kind of tools and techniques can we use as developers to do that, to extract something valuable out of that? Well, I think Twitter is actually a really interesting social network for me, because it's a genuinely real-time and live network where people are discussing the issues of the moment, and it's really in the moment. It's got a real pulse of what's going on, and that's actually something we saw with Turkey recently with the coup, where Twitter was leading all the news networks by half an hour, and that's a lot of time when someone's taking over your country. And its streaming API from a developer point of view is actually really cool, and it's a really good match for RX. So why get a room full of people together and talk about politics at a developer conference? Well, I think you'd have to say 2016 is quite a big year for politics, and there's a lot going on. As I mentioned, we've just had our federal election. And after a week of that, the result was so close that that's the only guy in the whole country who knew who'd won. And meanwhile, the UK has voted to break up with the EU, and the US has got this show kicking off. So there's a lot going on this year. It's a bit of an unusual year. But really, for this talk, it boils down to a really good example for RX, to some really great data to work with to show off what you can do with RX. So what data do we actually have to play with? We've got recorded tweet streams taken during episodes of the ABC's Q&A show, as well as the recent Democratic National Convention speeches just a couple of weeks ago in the US. And these tweet streams are being replayed in real time. So all the code that we see thinks this stuff is happening right now, and it gives us something more interesting to look at than just looking at whatever's going on Twitter right now. So we're going to see some techniques to work with this data, but these techniques are not just useful for politics or Twitter. You can use them to work on any real-time data that you've got flowing through your systems. So for anyone who's not already familiar with RX, it's a functional styler framework where you build up transformations on your data with chained operators. And it's really great for working with real-time data, and that's something I've really enjoyed using it with. It's originally from .NET and Microsoft, but today we're going to look at RxJS, and that's one of the most, well, probably the most active community for RX at the moment. And it's also available for Java and a whole lot of other platforms as well. As I said, if you haven't used RX, it does have a bit of a steep learning curve. And if you have used it, you've probably gone through that or are going through that. But if you're a functional programmer, or if you've used LINQ a lot with C#, there's a lot in common there. Even if you've just done a lot of async programming with JavaScript front or back end, there'll be some angle of familiarity for you to come at it with, and that's really valuable. But certainly I found starting with it, I loved LINQ, but it still took an extra big leap to get my head into RX, and it's something that takes quite a long time to really sort of change your way of thinking. So all the code we're going to see today is up on GitHub, so you can download the code and the sample data is with it, so you can actually replay everything we're seeing and go and do your own work on it. There's a link to that at the end of the talk, and we should have some time at the end for questions as well. Just quickly on Q&A, for anyone who doesn't know it, it's a panel show on Australia's national broadcaster, the ABC, where we get politicians, often senior ministers or even prime ministers, on to answer questions from the audience, and they broadcast that out live. But what they've really done well is get a big Twitter engagement with the show. So there's a lot of people sitting at home tweeting, often in rage or total agreement, but there's a lot of engagement with the audience and what's going on, and that plays out, and they put the Twitter information on the screen and broadcast that out. So there's real two-way engagement there, and that makes it interesting to look at with RX. In particular, we've got a couple of episodes to look at which are when, just before our election, we had Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten come on to sort of make their case for why they should be Prime Minister. And they faced questions from the audience, and they were there as a solo guest. So it's interesting to compare and contrast how those two episodes played out, especially now we know who won. So what are we going to see as we go along? We're going to have a look at measurements of how active the conversation is over time. And then we're going to look at getting a feel for what people are actually talking about at any given moment. And from there, we're going to start building on top of this and see, so we know how active the stream is. We'd like to know when it peaks. What are the moments when, for some reason, it jumps? And from that point, we want to know, why did it jump? What were the major topics that really drove that spike in traffic? So let's get started with the first piece that we're going to look at here, which is getting a basic feeling for the level of activity in the stream. So if we start with a stream of tweets that we're taking either from the Twitter API or in this particular case from a replay of the Twitter stream, and these tweets are arriving randomly over time, what we'd like to know is how active is that stream at any given moment. So how many tweets per minute are we seeing arrive to us on that stream? So really what we'd like to be able to do is generate something like this in real time in front of our eyes as it plays out, such that if you were actually running this on an episode of QA, you could see this happening in front of your eyes. So how are we going to go about doing this? Now, if you haven't seen a marble diagram before, this is a really basic version of one. And it's used to represent a series of events arriving over time, and therefore you can build on that to show how you're transforming the data from one type of stream to another type of stream and when the events happen. So this represents our stream of tweets, and each one of these is a tweet happening at some point in time, and it's coming to us. And we want to take that tweet stream and extract some kind of concept of how many tweets per minute we're seeing. So really, to be able to achieve that, we kind of want to look at windows of time of 1 minute in length, and then take all the tweets that arrive during that 1 minute window and count them up. And so what we're really doing here is taking this stream of tweets and transforming it into a stream of tweets per minute values. So what we've got at the bottom here is a stream that's going to push us one value every minute, telling us how many tweets per minute we're seeing right at that moment in time. So how can we use Rx to do this? So we're going to start with our source stream. And in Rx terminology, this is an observable. So if you're doing it in C#.NET, you're going to see the word observable everywhere. If you're doing it in JavaScript, you might not see it at all. And that's not really a bad thing, because I think it's actually easier to talk about as a stream than it is to talk about it as an observable. But that's our source stream. And we want to take these 1 minute windows of time out of that source stream. And RxJS has this operator window with time. So we just say to RxJS, I want 1 minute windows on this stream. And then from each of those windows, we're just going to extract the count of tweets we see. And that's all there is to taking a stream of tweets and generating a stream of tweets per minute values. You can. We'll get to that in a minute. So this approach is quite simple, and really the code's quite clean. But it's not perfect. In terms of the data it gives us, there's a few shortcomings. So we're only getting 1 point of data per minute here. And if you're looking at a Q&A episode, that's 60. It's a 1 hour show. You only got 60 points of data. It's not really a lot of data. And if you sort of were looking for spikes in that data, you're going to have maybe a minute's delay before you notice that a spike's happened. So you might go from 500 tweets a minute to 800 tweets per minute in consecutive values. And we know that that hasn't happened instantaneously, but we don't have any data points in the middle, so we don't get to see that ramp up. So really, it's a very coarse level of detail. And if you plot that out on a graph like we want to, you're going to get a very sort of rough-edged graph. So really, this 1 minute window is actually kind of working against us here, because it's reducing the number of data points we're getting. So why don't we just shorten the windows down to 5 seconds or something? Then we're going to get a lot more data points, And so obviously we're not going to have to wait very long before we see any spikes come in. But we're actually getting more data, but not actually better data. In fact, we're getting worse data. If you're taking only 5 seconds of time and trying to expand that out to a tweets per minute value, it's kind of like trying to take your pulse. If you only count two heartbeats and work out what your heartbeat per minute rate is, you don't actually get a very good quality number there. And if you do that consecutively, you're just going to get a heartbeat rate that's going like this. It doesn't mean your heartbeat's actually going like this. It's just your measurement's not very appropriate. Your sampling period's not very appropriate. So we've got lots of data, but it's not very good quality. So that's not a good solution either. So really, we want to keep our windows at 1 minute long. We just want more of them. So how can we do that? What if we had 1 minute windows, but we started a new window every 30 seconds? So now what we're going to have is rolling windows or overlapping windows. And let's take a bit of a closer look at what that really is going to look like. So each window is still a full minute long, but the next window starts before the previous one finishes. And so you're actually getting these, some of these tweets are shared by both windows. And that's sort of common to every window as it comes in. And so what we're getting is instead of a point of data every 1 minute, we get a point of data every 30 seconds. So we're getting these new points of data in the middle of all those measurements we previously had. So we've increased our resolution on our stream here, but we haven't sacrificed our data quality by shortening the window. So this is the code we had previously. How do we take this and turn it into overlapping windows where we're starting a window every 30 seconds? Well, like that. So RX has a lot of these kind of high-level concepts and makes your life easy to do these kind of things. So now we've got 1 minute windows starting every 30 seconds, overlapping streams or rolling windows. So let's look at all this code just together in one point, just to make it clear there's really not a lot to it. We take our source stream. That could be either coming from Twitter API or wherever you're getting your tweets from. You window them up into 1 minute windows, starting every 30 seconds, and then you extract the count from each window. The last thing you have to do is actually subscribe to it and do something with the values as they come in. So every time there's a new tweets per minute value that comes out of our stream, it gets pushed to us in subscribe, and we go do something useful with it, like putting it on the graph. So these overlapping or rolling windows are really powerful, and it's not necessary to keep it at every 30 seconds. We can ramp it up and do every 5 seconds, and that's what I've actually done for the graph we're about to see. And it's a technique used to sort of smooth out moving data and reduce noise out of a signal, and sort of make it less variable, less volatile. And it's sort of, I think in finance circles and statistics and so on, it's known as a moving average, where you're sampling a signal over time, and each successive sample has a lot in common with the previous sample. So let's have a look at what we can actually generate that out of that in real time. So this is a little dashboard I knocked up that's using this replayed stream of tweets. So we've got these two episodes of Q&A, and every tweet that was sent with a Conda hashtag during those episodes to replay as if they're happening in real time. But thankfully, because we're replaying them, it doesn't have to be in real time. In fact, it can be at 500 times real time, which means we don't have to sit here for an hour and watch this play out, which is always a benefit when you're talking about politics. So this is when Malcolm Turnbull came on to Q&A. And the first thing you can see right here at the beginning is a really quick ramp up. And that's just when the ABC starts broadcasting live. So I think that's interesting of itself, because you can see just how quickly people engage with it. It's not a gradual thing. That when the show starts, they're on Twitter. And I think that shows that power of Twitter in reacting to real-time events and really showing what's going on. But from that point on, it sort of settles between 500 and 600 tweets per minute. But you can see it's in no way constant or normal all the time. It doesn't sit there at a regular rate. There's lots of little small peaks and quite a few larger peaks and troughs through there as well. So that's not random noise. That's people reacting to a topic that they're seeing being discussed and engaging because they have something to say about it. Maybe it's really important to them, or maybe Malcolm Turnbull's just said something incredibly stupid. So this is how it played out for Malcolm Turnbull, and that's sort of peaking up towards 800 tweets per minute that we saw. So if we have a look at Bill Shorten's episode by comparison, you can see that there's a bit of a slower ramp up in the beginning, but he never gets near 800 tweets per minute. Now, there's any number of reasons that could be the case, and it might have even actually been a public holiday on the day he was talking, but for a person who's running for Prime Minister in a couple of weeks, you want people listening and you want them engaging, and they're engaging less with him than they were with Malcolm Turnbull. So if I was Bill Shorten and I could see these numbers in front of my face, he actually went first, but if it was in the other order, and you could see this, you'd be like, I need to do something to improve this conversation here because I'm not getting through. So that's just a sort of little glimpse into even just a basic tweet rate can be quite valuable to get a feel for, and when you compare it to other things, to get a feel for what's going on. So, where are we? So we've seen a way of getting a gauge on the level of activity that we're seeing, and there's all kinds of other measurements you could do, like how many active users we've got and that kind of thing, that are not too hard to do either. But we'll move on now and look at what people are actually talking about, and this takes a bit more work to generate. So this takes a few steps to take our stream of tweets and turn it into something that's useful for working out what people are talking about in a given moment. The first step we need to do is take this stream of tweets and extract all the words out of it so we can actually have a stream of words. And then once we've got that stream of words, we need to take these all these words and count up the number of times we're seeing the same words so we can work out which ones are the most frequent that we're seeing. So what we're really trying to get a feel of is what are the most discussed topics, and that's kind of a Twitter trending topics kind of thing. Sorry, I think the slides have gotten a bit out of order. So we're trying to generate a histogram that looks like this, but in real time. We don't want a retrospective histogram at the end of an episode. We want to know what's happening right now, because that's going to change in a few minutes, and then we can sort of see the difference between now and later. And it turns out if you want to know what are the most common words that people are tweeting about, you don't need RX, you don't need any kind of software, because that's them right there. And they're all useless. So we're going to filter them all out. So there's quite a bit of sort of data cleaning and text manipulation that goes into making something like this work well. And I've done an amount of it. It's not perfect by any means. So how are we going to take our stream of tweets and extract the words out of it? We want to take each tweet as it arrives. Wow, these have really messed up. So we want to take our stream of tweets and turn it into a stream of words. And we might be getting a stream of 700 tweets per minute. And once we take all the words out, we might end up with 10,000 words per minute. So there's going to be a really active stream, but RX will cope with that pretty much fine. So as each tweet comes in, we want to take all the words out of that tweet and then filter out the useless ones, so we end up with just a stream of useful words. So how are we going to do that with RX? We take each tweet as it arrives, and it's basically a string split. And you can do this, the better you do this, the better it works. You can split on spaces, and then you'll get full stops messing with you and so on. So there's punctuation and spaces, and you can use a regex to do it, but ultimately it's a string operation. Then we can use the filter operator, which is in RX, and use some kind of isValid method to say whether I like this word or not. If it's the word the, I'm going to dump it. And so you can have a big set of words that you're just going to filter out. And that's for this source data here. I've done a lot of that in terms of when Malcolm Turnbull's on Q&A, there's no point in seeing how much people are mentioning Malcolm Turnbull, because it's going to be very often. So you filter out his name and so on, and you can see other topics that are interesting. The other thing to note there is that it's quite a good approach to take this check and pull it into a method, because it can keep your code smaller and simpler, but also by putting a name on it, makes it easier for the next developer to come along and see what you're actually doing here. And that's not just an RX concept, that's a functional concept or a link concept or just a programming concept. but it makes a big difference with Rx. So in 2 lines of code, we've managed to take our stream of tweets and turn it into a stream of words. And it's literally just these 2 operators we're chaining together. And that's what we need for our next step, which is generating that histogram, or counting up all these words. So we've got a stream of words. We need to generate our histogram, our graphical representation of these word counts. And so what we're going to sort of just define our current period of time is, say, the most recent 5 minutes. So we want to know what people are talking about now, and we'll say that's in the last 5 minutes. So we're going to use 5-minute windows instead of 1-minute windows on this stream of tweet words. And then from each of those windows, we need to somehow take all the words that are coming in and build up a state of how many times we've seen each of these unique words. So we need some kind of data structure to hold that, and we're just going to use a hash map. So the key in the map will be each unique word, and the value will be how many times we've seen it. So we want to have a stream which pushes these hash map values just at the end of each 5-minute window, so that we can then have a count every 5 minutes of what people are currently talking about. And just as we did with tweets per minute, we could take these values every 5 minutes, but it's much better if we have rolling windows over time, because then we can see transitions from one topic to the next much more smoothly. So how are we going to do this in Rx? Well, the best approach with Rx when the problem looks quite large is to break it down into a smaller piece, because then you can change something else on the end of it and make it larger. So we're going to start with just one window and work out how to count that window up. And we need to start with some kind of intermediate state that we're going to consistently mutate or update as a new word comes in, and we can update our counts. So that intermediate state is our hash map. And then as each word arrives on the stream, we're just updating our count here. And you can see when we get this word for the second time, we don't add it again to the hash map, we just incremented our count. And so as each of the words arrive, we keep building up the state until we finally get to the end of the window, and that intermediate state value becomes the final value and the single result that we want to come out of that window. So how can we do that with Rx? So we're starting with our window of all the words that we're seeing. So this is what's come out of our window with time. And we want to take all of those words and reduce them down to just one single value. So if you're a functional programmer, you're probably quite familiar with this reduce concept. And it's available in Rx, and that's exactly what it does. It takes this stream and reduces it down to a single value. So we're not going to get a value out of this stream until it finishes, but because it's a 5-minute window, it will finish in 5 minutes. But what we have to give to reduce, just as any other place you'd use a reduce, is some way of taking each successive value and the current intermediate state and building up that new version of the intermediate state. So we just want to take our hash map and increment the number of times we've seen the words come in. So that's pretty simple. But you might be looking at that and think, well, that's not actually going to work, because the first time we see a word come through, it's not going to be in the hash map, so you can't increment what's not already there. You're going to get an error out of that. So what we actually need to do is check, is it already in the hash map? And if it is, then we can increment it. If it's not, we add it to the hash map. And just like we did before, that's going to be much better if we put that in a method instead of putting that in a big inline piece of code. And then even better, because the lambda arguments and the function arguments are exactly the same, we can collapse the whole thing down and just reference that method directly. And now our code is much more speaking about what it does, not how it's doing it. And we're getting sort of shorter and easier to read code. So the last thing we need to make this reduce work is the hash map. Where's it coming from? We're building up this hash map, but it's never been created. But we have to pass it in as the initial state to reduce. So this is where we start from. And we're just using a JavaScript object to act as our hash map here. And that's what's going to get passed back to us each successive word. And we can keep updating that hash map and roll forward. So that's all there is to reducing a window down to how many times we've seen each word come in. How do we take that and apply it to the whole stream of windows? Well, this is very similar to what we did with tweets per minute. We start with the code to handle one window, And we just use flat map across the whole stream of windows, and that's it. So that's quite a bit to take in, but let's see what it actually produces. So again, we'll have a look at Malcolm's Q&A appearance. And what we'll see here is that topics fly by quite, they're too fast to look at, but that's because they're being replayed at like 300 times speed. But you can see topics coming in like Medicare and the small business cuts, tax cuts that they were making. The gay marriage plebiscite got quite a lot of views. And as with Malcolm, always on Q&A, he never escapes the NBN. And that's probably quite relevant to how much we've been all complaining about the Wi-Fi here. But all the topics fly by, and you even get quite a bit of mention of Tony Jones. And if you don't watch Q&A, Tony Jones is the host. And his job there is to keep people in line and keep the politicians actually answering questions, which they don't always like to do. So occasionally he gets up there as well. And you even get people telling him he's waffling, which I quite like. But also, if I can find my mouse, when you look at how Bill Shorten went, it's a little bit of a different picture. There's still talk about the gay marriage plebiscite and the small business tax cuts. But there's quite a bit more talk about Tony Jones through the episode. He's got negative gearing, but Tony Jones gets right up there at the top quite a bit. That's probably not awesome if you're Bill Shorten. And we'll have a bit of a dig at that later as well. If you're on Q&A to get your message across about why you want to be elected, your message has got nothing to do with Tony Jones. So another interesting angle that you can get out of this is you can plot the frequency of these words over time. So this is a screenshot. You can generate this in real time. It didn't work so well for the demo, and I sort of ran out of time. But this is taken from Hillary Clinton's speech at the Democratic National Convention just recently. And her speech is an hour long, and there's a whole lot of topics that go through and a whole lot of response to those topics on Twitter. But the success of those responses is really varied. But these points were by far the biggest ones that got picked up over time. And the first point here is when she says about Donald Trump, don't trust somebody who says, I alone can fix it. We have to fix it. We have to all fix it together. And she talks about that for a bit. And the audience really picks up on this word fix. And that topic really gets across, and people are really engaging with it. The next thing that really picks up is when she says, I believe in science. And she's talking about climate change and trying to differentiate herself from Donald Trump, who's been a bit of a climate change skeptic, we could say. And again, that's, she's speaking to her crowd, right? But again, that's really being picked up by her audience. The last one during her speech is when she has a real dig at poor old Donald and says, we can't trust somebody who can be baited with a tweet to have control of nuclear weapons. And again, you can really see that point hits home. But what I actually thought was interesting here was this last one, which wasn't during her speech and it wasn't something she said. This is actually after she finished. President Obama made one single tweet, and he said, something along the lines of, she's great, she's tested, she's ready, she never quits. And that tweet just pumped out there. People really jumped on that. And it was just one single tweet. And it's had pretty much as much impact on Twitter as the other major points from her talks, from her whole speech did. So it's really interesting to see the value. And you can imagine what this kind of information would be worth to the Democratic Party, analyzing how well their message is getting across, especially to see that tweet had so much value. And I'm sure it wasn't him just sitting at home going, oh, this is a really good speech, I should just tweet this. But whatever they planned, it worked, right? So if you look at Obama's speech himself, there were a lot of topics, again, that got picked up. But there's one topic here that you can compare. He's got love and hope and talking about how qualified she is, and they're all down the bottom. But his one point here when he mentions Donald Trump and everyone goes booing, everyone goes crazy, and he's like, don't boo, vote. And that gets hugely picked up. And nothing gets picked up in America like a put down, but that's hugely successful. And I think that's interesting in a country like the US, which has voluntary voting, where your campaigning's not just about bringing in new supporters. It's convincing your existing supporters to actually go out and vote. And you can see in the beginning, this vote word has almost no traction, but there's a very long residual afterwards where people are still talking about voting. And that's what they want people to be talking about. They want people to actually go and vote. So again, if you're running that campaign, you want to be looking at these kind of things and seeing, right, we really hit home here. Especially if you write a whole speech and you're like, okay, I want to know, does this point that's really important get across? So I'm sure they are happy about that. So there's some quite interesting insights you can get out of, not a lot of code. So we've seen now how what people are talking about. Let's have a look at ways of identifying spikes in traffic. So we've seen before our tweets per minute, but what we actually want to know now is when does our conversation heat up? Or a more concrete way of saying that is when does that tweets per minute value jump significantly? So we want to be able to map out the points in time at which the conversation is really ramping up. And we want to be able to do that in real time. It's a lot easier to do this in retrospect, but to be able to do it in real time when you haven't seen the data that's coming, that's a different problem. So this is how we generated our tweets per minute, and we're going to use that as our starting point. So previously we started from the tweet stream. Now we're going to use this as our starting point and start from our tweets per minute stream. And as I said, that's kind of a familiar or a common approach with RX is to build more analysis or more manipulation on top of more simple manipulation. And after we finish here, we're actually going to build on top of this again. So if this is our stream of tweets per minute values, and they're all coming in, there's numbers every 5 seconds, lots of values, and let's say it looks roughly like that when you plot it out. So we can see there's a real spike here at the right-hand side. So at what point in time do we want our code to say, right, this is a spike that's happening right now? Is it this first point here? That seems like the ideal goal we'd want to aim for because that's, to our eyes, that's when it really picks up. But you remember this is in real time, so at this point in time, we won't have any of these following points of data, and we have no idea the next value might come in and drop straight back down where it came from, and there's nothing special about this point at all. It could be the tiniest little peak, someone coughed or spilled their drink on TV or something, really not very important. So if not this point, then is it the next point? Or the one after? Or do we try and find the very top of the peak? But do we even know that this is the top of the peak? The next point is downwards, but maybe that's just a temporary pause and it's just about to take off again. So this is a very hard problem to solve in real time when you don't know the data that's just about to come in. And none of these points here is significantly higher in value from the previous point. So you can't look at it and say, well, I've just gone up by a huge amount from the previous point, therefore I'm in a spike right now. But the reason why all these points are so close together in value is because of that rolling windows. It's because the tweets they're sampling overlap very closely with the tweets the previous value was sampling. So when you're running a new window every 5 seconds, that previous value has got 55 seconds of shared tweets to count up. So those values are going to be really close together. And that's what gives us a nice smooth curve instead of a really ragged edged one. But it makes it very hard to compare 2 consecutive values and say that's a spike because they're always going to be really close together. But if we rethink what we're really trying to do here, we're trying to say, when does our current level of activity, when is it significantly higher than normal? And normal is whatever you want to define it as, and that depends on your data and what kind of spikes you're trying to detect and which ones you're trying to not detect. So in this case, basically we could say we want to compare our current minute of tweets per minute with the preceding minute before that. And now you can see this is covering quite a different area of the curve, and it's going to be much more obvious to our code to see these 2 values and see how different they are and detect a spike. But actually, if we're trying to measure normal, there's no reason why normal has to be 1 minute. In fact, it's probably better off if we're talking about a 60-minute show. Something like 2 minutes seemed to work a lot better from the data I had. And this comes down to sort of understanding your data and your situation and how quickly it's likely to move and how long it will stay at a normal rate. So a discussion topic in Q&A might sit on a certain topic for a few minutes. So a couple of minutes window range for normal worked quite well. And as we saw that using those rolling windows and a full minute window was all about smoothing our curve out. So using a 2-minute window smooths it out even more. And so this 2-minute window is much slower to react to spikes because it's sampling so much older data to measure that count. And when you put them together like that, you can really see the difference between these two curves. And that means our code can see the difference as these values come in and say, right now is a lot higher than normal. So that's the approach we'll use. Let's have a look at how we'll actually do it. So if we take our tweets per minute stream that we had, wrap that up into a function that we can use, and then specify to that function how long we want those windows to be. So our current tweet rate will use 1-minute windows, and our normal rate will use 2-minute windows. Now we want to put these two streams together and work out the difference as the values come in as a percentage. And that, once we do that, we can actually see that most of these values here on the left are all very low values because there's not a spike going on. And this is building one stream from two other streams and putting them together. We can see here on the right-hand side, this is where the spikes actually happened. This percentage value has suddenly jumped. And we don't want a stream of spikes that's telling us nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. That's not useful. So what we really want to do is filter out all those low values and take just the moments when there is actually a spike. And so we need some kind of threshold that we can judge to say this is significant enough that I care about it as a spike. And again, this comes down to how sensitive you want to be, how many false negatives you can or false positives you can cope with, and how many misses of spikes you can tolerate, and your data itself. So for my data, I was using 15%, and that seemed to work quite well. A jump of 15% in the traffic was actually pretty significant. So the RX code to do this, we're going to start with our current tweet rate, and we're getting that out of our wrapped up function. Our normal tweet rate, we use the exact same function, but we say we want 2-minute windows. But if you remember that chart with the graph earlier, we want them to be back-to-back or side-to-side windows, not overlapping windows. So we need to delay this normal tweet rate by a minute to put it behind this current one. And that's a nice operator RX has got. Anything that comes out of normal will get delayed. We'll see it 1 minute later. So again, RX has these operators that really help you build these kind of high-level concepts quite well. So now we need to put these two streams together and work out the difference somehow. And RxJS has this with latest from method, which is really quite handy. It's not actually in the .NET version of Rx as far as I know, but you can build it with combine latest. So what with latest from does is take every value, as every new value comes in on the current tweets per minute, it gives us the latest from the normal stream. And then that's exactly what we want. As our current tweets per minute changes, we want to know the latest normal rate, and we can work out if there's a big difference there or not. So we have to give it a function that takes that current rate and takes the value from each of the two streams there and gets some kind of result. So we're going to wrap that up in a method called getDifference, and that's going to return our percentage. And once again, just as we saw before, same arguments to the lambda and to the function. So we can just collapse that down. And again, we've got some nice simple code here. And then the next thing we want to do is filter out all those low values that aren't actually spikes we care about. And so now what we've ended up with is a stream that's gone from these two streams, we've put them together. And this spike stream might be quiet for minutes or even hours on end, just publishing nothing because there's nothing going on. But as soon as there's a spike that happens, this stream kicks into action and it starts pushing events about these spikes, and then it goes quiet again. So let's see all that code together in one place. We start with our current and normal streams for 1 and 2 minute windows. We've delayed the normal stream to put it side by side with current. And then we put them together with latest from, getDifference we use to work out how different the two values are, filter out the low values, and subscribe. subscribe and go and throw it on a graph or something like that, and make something useful out of it. So again, it's not a lot of code. We're just building on lower level constructs to make high level constructs. So let's go and see how this actually plays out in real time. So we'll just have a look at Malcolm's episode here. You can see right at the start there's a whole lot of spikes because as far as the streams are aware, this level down here is what's normal. And suddenly the traffic's gone crazy. So all of this is identified as a spike. But once we hit sort of a regular level of tweet behavior, then we're pretty much only picking out the tops of the biggest spikes here. And this comes down to a bit of the tuning and what threshold you use for your filtering. And again, we're not picking up any of these small spikes, which I didn't care about. I didn't want to see sort of 20 or 50 spikes, unique sort of moments in time across an episode. I was trying to get sort of 5 or 10. So this code worked quite well, but it's not perfect. And there's one particular spike there near the right-hand side that's got no red dots on it, and that's when everyone's bitching about the NBN. And unfortunately, because the last few minutes before that were quite high, normal was already quite high, and that didn't really look like a spike at that time. So if I made it sensitive enough to pick that up, it picked all these ones up as well. So this is kind of an imperfect solution, and it was one of these problems that you're always balancing how many smaller spikes you want to pick up versus how many bigger spikes you don't want to miss. So let's have a look at what we can do with that. We've seen now how we can measure when the conversation spikes. But what about when that spikes? It just makes me want to know why. So we saw the tweets per minute were moving along, and I wanted to know, to be able to see that the spikes were happening at those moments. And now I can see the spikes. I want to know why they're spiking. So really, I want to know what are the hot topics of the episode? What topics were the biggest issues for the audience? And that's really telling us, why are these spikes happening? What are people talking about in those moments? So what we're going to see out of this is coincidental with the spikes is what people were talking about. And really what we're generating in real time is play-by-play highlights of Q&A. So what I'm really doing is doing you all a favor, because you don't actually have to watch the show. You can just put this on your screen and see the important bits and skip the rest. And actually, this turns out to be the easiest thing of the entire talk. And some of you might already see exactly how this is going to work. Because we already know how to generate a stream of spikes. And we already know how to generate a stream of topics. And all we're trying to say is our hot topics is, if we put both of these in a method, our hot topics are what's currently being discussed when the spikes happen. So if we take the spike as a trigger and take the latest values from our topic stream, we know what topics are driving these spikes. So we don't hear about the topics when it's not particularly hot traffic. But as soon as that level of tweets really jumps, we suddenly get a value of what people are talking about. And then we've got a choice to make about how many of those topics do we want to actually call the important ones that are driving this spike. So you could say, I'm just going to take the top, the very most frequent topic right now, and call that the driver of this spike. You could take the top 3. You could say, I'm going to take anything with up to 50% mentions of the number of mentions of the top. Again, this is all down to your data and how you want it to work out. So what I ended up doing was taking something, I think it was anything up to 70% of the most frequent mention got included in the bag of topics that we were saying was driving the spike. But that's all there is. And for me, this is the thing I wanted to know when I first started digging into the data, is why are these spikes coming on, what's going on? But it's actually the easiest thing to do. So let's have a look at how this actually plays out. So we'll start from Malcolm. I guess it's only fair considering he is the Prime Minister. And this particular screen does chug along a bit, partly to do with the fact that I'm replaying it at 300 times speed, and I've got all these overlapping windows. But you can see as these peaks come in, we're getting this play-by-play summary of all of those topics in real time. And you can imagine the value of this, even just to Tony Jones, the host of Q&A. If he had this right in front of his face, maybe he does. They do quite a bit of work with Twitter for Q&A. But if he had this in front of his face, you could see, holy cow, we've just gone crazy on the plebiscite. Everyone's really plugged in on this at home, because he's only got an audience of a few hundred people in front of him to judge off. But if he can see that Twitter's going off on this topic, he can be like, right, this is important. Let's dig into this topic a bit more. And conversely, if he can see nothing's going on, it's actually maybe time to move the conversation on to something else. So if we actually scroll down here and see what the biggest topics were, I'm sort of seeing the gay marriage plebiscite gets quite a bit, and that's fair enough when you look at where Malcolm Turnbull's taken that. Medicare was a big campaigning point for Labor, and there was a whole lot of stuff about privatization that was being put to Malcolm Turnbull. The company tax cuts. There's also some talk about suicide and mental health and so on, and this is where you can actually see, rather than one or two topics really driving it, there's quite a few different words that we're getting, all similar levels of mentions. And then there's a really interesting point in the episode when there's a detainee on our Manus Island Detention Center who submits a question via video, obviously relating to asylum seekers. And no surprise, that really sets Twitter off into a big discussion. And you can see that here. It's sort of, it merges in with the mental health and it becomes its own spike here. And then we see the NBN, and we finish off with a bit of arts funding. So that's Malcolm. Let's see how Uncle Bill went. So as we saw before, Bill Shorten's level of traffic was quite a bit lower than Malcolm's. Not fantastic, but who knows? You know, there could be any number of reasons for that. But we pretty much, from the start, get into Tony Jones. And if anybody saw that episode, there was a lot more interaction between Tony Jones and Bill Shorten than there was with Malcolm Turnbull. And Tony Jones was keeping him on quite a short leash. And Bill Shorten was having a few clips back, and he scored a few points as well. But if you look at the sort of play-by-play summary of the whole episode, it's all Tony. So when you're running for Prime Minister and you're going on a show to try and convince people that they should vote for you, you don't want them thinking, oh, this Tony Jones guy. That's not winning you any points, right? So that's I'm sure from Bill Shorten's camp, if they could see this or did see this, that's not what they were hoping for out of this episode. So again, I think that's a really interesting insight that you get out of playing with this data. And these are just a few examples of what you can do. Any angle you want to dig into, if you've got the data for it, you can do it. And RX really gives you a lot of access to data and works really well for this kind of thing. So just a quick recap. We've had a quick look at how to judge the level of activity on a stream. And then we looked at what people are actually talking about in a moment. And then we've looked at when are the moments when that conversation really spikes, and be able to get our code to notify us in those moments. And then we've built on top of all of that together to actually work out why is people being driven to engage in the topic in that moment? What topic is it that's grabbed their attention? And so the insights we've got out of that, I think, are quite interesting. We've seen quite a bit of interplay between Bill Shorten and Malcolm Turnbull, and considering how close the election was, who knows, with some of this kind of analysis running through the campaign, who knows how you might be able to steer things better. And in Australia, I don't know how sophisticated we are with that. In the US, I have no doubt that there are very expensive consultancies already doing this, and a lot more than this right now. And I think it was really interesting actually to look at the Democratic Convention. I would have had a lot more of a look at that, but the data was huge. We get sort of 700 tweets per minute for Q&A, but the Twitter API will cap you at about 3,000 tweets per minute and then sample from then on. And I was just pegged at 3,000 tweets a minute for days with the convention. And that makes it very hard to look at tweets per minute because it's a flat line. It doesn't tell you much. And it's the same with the EU referendum as well, as that whole train wreck happened. So there's some really interesting data in that as well, and I ended up with way more data than I could make a 1 hour talk out of. But what I think is cool is we actually haven't used that many operators to do this, and there's not that many different approaches. we've really leveraged time windows, and that's windows are really useful for getting current pictures in the moment and then seeing how that changes over time, and especially when you overlap them to smooth out your signal and really sort of increase your data quality there. We've seen how we can reduce windows or streams down to get rid of, filter out values we don't want, or reduce the entire stream down to a single value that sort of summarizes or aggregates all that information into some form that you want to use. And then we've seen how with latest from can combine these two, combine these streams to sort of generate combined intelligence from two different sources of information. But if you look at the documentation for RX and you look at the list of operators, it looks a lot like that. I think there are literally hundreds of them, and maybe I know 50%, maybe. It's huge. There's a lot more that you can do with it. So what else can it do, really quickly? Apart from political analysis of Twitter, which may not be what everyone here wants to rush home and do. We can still, on social media, you can track anything that's live. So particularly things like sports, natural disasters as they happen, you can see that happening, or just news. And again, you saw that a lot with Turkey. And similarly, financial markets and discussions about stock announcements and so on. There are definitely companies out there that are doing Twitter analysis to see trends as they happen. You can even look at things like if your company makes an announcement, what's the social media reaction? And not just look at that in a historical point of view, but look at that as it's playing out. If you've got a 1 hour, like maybe you're Apple and you're doing your big keynote, you want to be tracking in real time, what are people really reacting to right now? Do they care about the iPad 17 or not? And that's the kind of thing you can look at. But apart from social media, you can do a lot with monitoring as well, especially performance monitoring. And you can get rates of traffic into your site, and you can look at when does that peak and trough, exactly the same way as we've seen before, and exactly the same kind of thing with your response time. And from there, you can generate alerts. And you probably don't want to generate an alert and wake someone up when you get one bad response time. So how many bad responses and how bad do they have to be before you call it an alert? And again, that's sort of a window and a threshold and all those kind of things we've seen, and it's your judgment applied on top of your understanding of your data. And then you can also look at your site's usage after your company makes announcements. So you can look at your company makes an announcement, you look at Twitter, or your company makes an announcement, you look at your traffic. But also you can even look into user behavior. So you can look into your high-value customers and see what they're doing on your site compared to your normal customers. So you can look at new customers and compare them. You can look for lost business as it's happening. So any sessions that are timing out or transactions that don't go all the way to actually pushing the pay button. So if you see a sudden drop in the number of people actually committing your transactions, maybe you've got a flaky network card or your credit card provider is not working properly or something like that. And again, that's something you can see in real time and generate alerts out of. You could even use it for things like fraud detection. If your measurement of fraud detection is people adding a whole lot of new credit cards that they've just stolen to your site so they can see if they work, that's again something you can look at a rate of over time. You could say, show me any users who have a very different rate of traffic on our site compared to normal users, that kind of thing. So what we're seeing here is that RX combined with interesting data gives you real-time insights that can be really valuable. Even if the data is dry, even drier than politics, adding that perspective of time and aggregation can make it interesting and draw out some interesting patterns there that you just weren't seeing before. And real-time data is everywhere. It's not just on Twitter, and it's not just about politics. There's very little data out there that's actually genuinely static and not changing. If it is genuinely static, you'd hard code it in your code. So looking at patterns of how that data changes can really reveal interesting information. So I hope I've inspired some of you to go and look at your own systems and your own data and see what you might be able to get out of it with RX. So I do have some time for questions at the end here. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming. Sorry? Yep.
RX is intended to follow a functional paradigm. And I was a bit surprised
Sure. So for anyone who didn't hear the question, the question is RX is functional, and functional programming is meant to be much more about immutable data. But I had this epic hack in there where every time I saw a new word, I mutated a dictionary and returned that out. So could we do something with group by? So I looked at group by because I thought that's going to be a much nicer solution. I'll be able to sleep a bit easier at night with it. And I think it would work, but part of the problem I had was that with these tweet streams, there's so many unique words. I was literally, when you group by, you end up with a new stream per unique key. And so I was going to have as many streams as there were unique words in those 5-minute windows. And I wasn't just running a 5-minute window and then another one. I was running 5-minute windows overlapped every 5 seconds. And then I was running those at 500 times speed. So it really made this thing come to a big standstill. But I think if I was doing something for a production system, I'd very much go down that path first and see if I cannot make it work or cannot make it work well, then sometimes you do, I've found, have to step back to something that's half nice, half hack to make something that actually performs well. But it's a valid point. It's not the most beautiful approach to solve that problem. Yep.
I was going to ask the get tweet stream method. I used to do Twitter analysis without RxJS 6 years ago. They didn't even have a streaming API yet, so I did the REST endpoint.
Oh, really?
So that was really painful for me.
Yeah.
How do you achieve this stream monitoring?
It's actually the Twitter. So the question was, how do you get a handle on the tweet stream from Twitter? And I've only used the API recently, so it sounds like previously it didn't support streaming, but right now it does. So I use .NET code with Rx to pull the data in and save it to files. And I used a .NET library from NuGet, I think it was called TweetEnvy. And that just publishes you an event every time a tweet comes through. And then you can convert that event to an observable and then do all kinds of stuff with it from that really easily. And it's a push API from Twitter as far as I know, but it was all wrapped up in this package. So it's literally include the NuGet package, put your credentials in, and now you've got an event and you go, I want to listen to tweets with a #Quanda hashtag, and you just get an event when they come in.
So like a massive data from Twitter coming in, like gigs and gigs of tweets every time?
It is, yeah, it can be, especially with big stuff like the US, the Democratic Convention. So they, as I said before, when you hit about 3,000 tweets per minute, they'll cap you. So if you want to get every single tweet, and that's really important to you, and you're going to hit that kind of traffic level, that's when you need to start paying. And that's very custom, and you have to go to Twitter or GNIP and get that kind of data. But for a talk, I don't have the kind of money to do that. But also Twitter's very unforgiving with your connection and your program. If you start falling behind, they just cut you off, because they can't afford to sit there and buffer everybody who's falling a bit behind and buffer all the tweets that they haven't received yet, because they're just going to end up with them all backing up on their own plate. If you make your code simply see the disconnect and reconnect straight away, they'll get angry about that too. So you do have to be a bit careful about it. And I definitely saw times when during the EU referendum when, because I was running this on AWS and the little cheap instance I had was struggling a bit. So yeah, your bandwidth matters and your processor speed matters with it. Yep.
I noticed that you had a few variables there that were just basically tweaking the cutoffs for when something becomes a hot topic or whatever. And I think that works okay when you're looking at data that you have and you can try it a few times to really get the right percentage. But what if it's a one-off event, so like a new referendum?
Yeah. So the question is, for anyone who missed it, there is some hard-coded thresholds and so on in there, and that's easy enough to do when you've already seen the data or you've seen similar data, and that's a really valid point. And it comes down to trying to have some understanding of what you're seeing. And it's interesting that with the EU referendum itself, it was so unique that they couldn't even predict the outcome before, because none of their polling data was valid because they hadn't done an EU referendum before. So to some extent, an event as unique as that, you're really going to struggle to know. So I reached for these sort of hard-coded limits to make something useful out of it. I'm sure that there would be more complex techniques you could use to while things are rolling, gauge an idea of how much, what a regular amount of traffic spike you're seeing is and so on. So it really comes down to your use case about how sophisticated you want to make it. And obviously, the more sophisticated it is, probably the more complicated it is. Cool. Any other? Yep.
As I was looking at each of those, I was thinking to myself, it'd be really interesting to see sentiment of those. And I noticed recently Azure has an API you can just pretty much send your tweets into or whatever text, and it will send that back in a real-time basis. Do you think that's realistic to reroute them through something like that?
So the question is about using sentiment analysis in real-time streams. I honestly don't know the performance characteristics of those. I haven't used sentiment analysis. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. And I know some people in the UK who are using sentiment analysis on financial streams to pick out trends and work out whether they should buy or sell stocks really quickly. And they seem to be doing okay because they haven't gone back to their day jobs. I think it'd be really interesting. I'm always skeptical about sentiment analysis, but I'm not a machine learning guy, so quite possibly they've come up with ways to do it. Twitter's actually interesting because it forces you to be brief, and so I actually think in some ways sentiment analysis might be more successful there. Even just people using #fail, or if you look for profanity in a stream, right? It's pretty good negative sentiment, right? Whereas if you're analyzing a Facebook post this big, is that negative or positive? Probably that's negative, that's positive. Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting space, and I would love to be working on that kind of problem. I think that would be an interesting problem to solve. Anyone else? Oh, cool. Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming. If you want the code on GitHub, that's the link there. Otherwise, grab me on Twitter or check out my blog. But yeah, thanks for coming.